Hi, I'm Phil Tierney from Chester, Connecticut. You are listening to ICRV Radio, the stream feeding the River Valley.
Well, good afternoon or good morning, no matter what time zone you're in. This is Cynthia Clegg from the Community Foundation of Middlesex County, and this is a very special show to honor, and we are humbled to honor the memory of Liz Petry, who unfortunately passed away a few weeks ago. And Liz inspired us all. That's all I can say. And I am honored to have, of course, Dave with us, who knew her well, and also Christy Billings. Christy, thank you from the Russell Library for being here, because, you know, she loved you.
We're going to celebrate Liz today.
We are going to celebrate.
And let people know what a wonderful lady she was.
Oh my gosh, she was absolutely incredible.
You knew her in so many capacities, and you're right, we were fortunate enough to be able to have her around this round table, either literally or figuratively, so many times, and sharing her story and just how she put words together, how she motivated, how she led by example. And you knew her far better than I and Christy, you dear friends. But what a remarkable person. How would this world be a better place? I mean, if we could just clone her a couple times.
Really? I'm working on it. If we could not only cure the ills of the world, because Liz had a heart that was bigger than she was, but I think of her in terms of, from the Community Foundation's aspect, I think of her in so many different ways. Think of her as somebody that she was a founder. She was part of the Community Foundation from the very beginning, just really right there when we were this little grassroots community foundation, and with people who had a vision for what we could be. So she just helped us carry that forward. She was also a founder of the Sarah Rosenbaum Fund for Women and Girls. And I know people have said that she really advocated for everybody, advocated for everybody's rights. So when you think way back when, 20 some odd years ago, she was right there with 59 other women starting one of the very first funds for the Community Foundation. And that fund has done so much to help empower women and girls, not only in our community, but far beyond.
So just to let everybody know how this is going to unfold, we were lucky enough to be able to record her. Cynthia, you know, we've edited 25,000 pieces in our history. This is one that I didn't want to edit. Really what we did is, because who wants to cut her words, right, Christy? It's like,
we were talking about that. It's very difficult to do that.
So what we're doing is excerpting several of the occasions that we had to have a great in-depth conversation with her, and it's going to touch on the various facets of her life, from her work with the Community Foundation, her leadership in the community, her advocacy, her volunteerism, her want for legacy, and again leading by example. So if it's okay with you, let's kind of start out by one of your conversations with her, where you kind of touched on all these points, and I think it ends up with a program that's near and dear to you, Christy, and we'll take it from there. So first, here's Cynthia along with Liz Petry.
Liz, you inspire us all. I said that in front of an audience and embarrassed you, but I'm going to say it again and embarrass you. You inspire us all. So
thank you, Cynthia.
Oh my gosh. But more than just being an author and being a pillar of the community of Middletown and Middlesex County, because she lived in Old Saybrook, I want you to all know how much a part of the CFMC family she is. So, Liz, my gosh, I mean, you are one of the founders of the Fund for Women and Girls now, I think 22 years young, and former board member way back when we just got started. And then you also are gracious enough to have a fund in honor of your parents, which it's just so remarkable. We're so honored.
Thank you. Well, that fund was actually inspired by the fact that my parents just adored the arts. Of course, when they married, they were living in New York, and they traveled all over. My mother actually became a member of the American Negro Theater, and she was there right about the same time, I think, as Ossie Davis a little bit before Harry Belafonte. But she played the part of this snoopy newspaper reporter. How appropriate is that?
Oh, that's great. Oh, that's great. And I mean, a lady of many talents. But before we get into, I'll just say the type of fund that Liz set up in honor of her parents is called the Field of Interest Fund. And the field of interest is the arts. And Liz's fund provides grant making money for organizations that deal in the arts. But go back a little bit. Now we're learning so much more about your mom. So tell us more, and maybe there are some new listeners who don't know who your mom was.
Okay, well, my mother was Ann Petry. She was actually born in Old Saybrook, well, Saybrook then, and she was the daughter of Peter Lane and Bertha James, and he was the first African-American pharmacist in Connecticut. Bertha, her mother, ran 3 businesses. We're talking at the turn of the 20th century, so 1900. And she raised a family, of course, and so forth. And my mother went on, after she became a pharmacist and worked in the family business for a while, she became a novelist. And she wrote the first novel to publish more than 1 million copies by an African-American woman.
Wow.
She was living in New York at the time, and this was after actually she played the nosy newspaper reporter in a play called On Strivers' Row, and it was mocking the sort of very upscale, pretend to be white bourgeoisie Black folks guided on what was called Sugar Hill in Harlem, but they changed it to Strivers' Row in the play, and she was Miss Tilly Petunia. I was have to struggle to say that name. Anyway, the point of that was that my parents adored the arts. And I decided when I set up the fund through the Community Foundation that I wanted it to be something to do with the arts. I mean, I know there's lots of important things like homelessness and feeding the hungry and so forth, but I thought people needed something to nurture their souls as well as their bodies. But I also realized that I didn't have the expertise to figure out where these donations should go. So I left it up to the folks at the Community Foundation to figure out who's making the donations to what. So that's the point. And then I add to it periodically as I can. So I'm hoping that over the long haul, it will give places like Oddfellows, it's a little extra spending money.
And we need the arts more than ever after this 2+ years of the pandemic. I mean, and I think nurture the soul, I think, is a really good way to do it. So say it rather. So thank you for doing that. But, Liz, it's your turn to brag too, because if I'm not mistaken, and I'm usually not mistaken, my husband would tell me, that you are quite the artist yourself and quite the novelist and writer. So tell us a little bit about your work.
Well, I've actually published 2 works of nonfiction. The first was a book called Can Anything Beat White? A Black Family's Letters. And that was published in 2005 by the University Press of Mississippi. And basically, my grandmother saved these 400 letters in this tin that had held ice cream cones, came from our pharmacy. She passed them down to my mother. My mother used the tin as basically one of many places where she stored papers and books. So I wasn't even aware that the tin was underneath this pile of stuff. And then after she passed away, my father sort of said, get that stuff, only he didn't say stuff, out of the house. So I took it to my apartment in Cromwell and opened it up and discovered these amazing letters that were written between, I think the earliest was 1873. And then they stopped pretty much around 1910 because the main correspondent, who was my grandmother's sister, moved in next door to her, so they didn't really have to write letters to each other anymore. But that was just such a wonderful adventure. And I had a fabulous time learning history in a way that I never would have learned it in school, from these letters that were sent from Hawaii, from the Philippines, from all over the South. And then the second book was called At Home Inside, and it's a memoir about my mother. And that was based on, my interactions with her, but also on her correspondence and journals and so forth. And I do have a novel coming out in November. Called, yes, called All Other Free Persons. And it's fiction, but it's based on the life of a woman who was born in Lebanon, Connecticut, and was an indentured servant and actually got herself arrested for theft when she was about 14 years old, of all things. But she wound up becoming this incredibly successful businesswoman in New London later on. And it's kind of a quest, and I'm not going to say any more about it right now.
We have dibs on doing the I don't know what you call it, the book signing or whatever.
Oh, book launch, yay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Seriously, you heard it all here, folks. November. Stay tuned. I think it's great.
Hey, Liz,
Okay.
I have to ask,
Yes.
how emotional an experience is it to sort through the raw material for your first book, the 400 plus letters that I would imagine are connecting to you and felt in a soulful way, not just in the content, but it's on what type of paper they're written on. It's the type of penmanship. It's the stories and the context. I mean, it just has to be a trip and really an emotional and perhaps stressful journey sorting through that raw material.
It was. The one letter that got me started was one that was written in pencil. It was on nice paper, but it was written in pencil from my grandmother's younger brother in 1905. He was down in Georgia. Why he went to Georgia, we'll never know. But he wrote her a letter saying, please send $35 so I can bribe the sheriff. I was arrested because I shot a white man for bothering me. And I read that letter. It was hard to read. I was standing by the window because I didn't have quite enough light. And I had to sit down. I got really lightheaded. And then I stood back up and read the letter again and said, I've got a book. And it went on from there in terms of just not only the emotional content of the letters, but I started hearing their voices in my head. There was 13-year-old Harry James, who was the youngest brother, and he was off at Hampton, what was then Hampton Institute, now Hampton University. And he would write to my grandmother saying, oh, please send candy, please send some money. Oh, and I can't believe they told you that I chopped off part of my thumb. Oh, and there was just one shot after another.
Wow. Wow.
But I loved every minute of it. I have to tell you, even the emotionally, challenging parts of it, it was a labor of love to do it.
Well, for me, the fact that you're writing in a day and age where people are have to be reminded what books actually look like in the day of the podcast and all this technology. It feels like if we don't advance this art form, it may go away. So it's important for people to get engaged. And I think you continue and have for a long time helped help veterans and help people at Russell Library. I mean, it's important to participate in this art form as a consumer. And, if you feel like, sharing some stories, nothing wrong with that.
Well, absolutely. And we should all be better storytellers in a positive light. So Liz, I interrupted you, but I have another question for you.
Sure.
Oh, okay. So Dave mentioned it, and you do a lot of work with veterans. So tell us how that got started, because that's a whole other unique group of people that we can't lose sight of.
Well, that's another labor of love. This now 13 years ago, Russell Library approached me because they do an annual one book, one city program. I don't know if they're still doing it actually, but each year they would select a book and have people in the community read it and then do all kinds of activities around it. And the year that they asked me to come in, they had read Unbroken by Laura Hillebrand, which is the story of Louis Zamperini, who was basically started out as this dreadful juvenile delinquent. He discovered running track. He ran in the 1936 Olympics in Germany. P.S. stole a Nazi flag out from underneath the Nazis' noses. And then, of course, got into World War II, was captured by the Japanese and tortured dreadfully, and eventually came home, went into a tailspin, obviously had terrible PTSD, but then found his way back. And Laura Hillebrand wrote his story, and Russell Library wanted me to conduct a writing workshop for veterans for 3 weeks. Well, it's 13 years later, and we're still going. Basically, the format originally, and then we branched out, was I would give them a writing prompt. So the first one, for example, we based on the book was, Louis says in the book that he admired his older brother, and that's what got him out of trouble and into running track. So I had them write about somebody that they admired. And we took prompts at the beginning, we took prompts from the book. And then, as I said, we've since branched out, but we're still going. We have varying numbers of veterans. We started out actually with 2 from World War II, although they've both since passed away. And our one veteran from the Korean War era has also. So now it's all people who served either in Vietnam or during the Vietnam era, including one Army nurse who is just wonderful. She's a poet, and she's added so much to the group because obviously women weren't joining the military then in the way they are now. And I'm just so glad to have her and everybody else. But it's just a fabulous group. And we actually mastered the technology of meeting over Zoom during the pandemic. But it's worked out really well, and it's just been fabulous.
Fabulous. Oh, it's so good to hear her voice, isn't it? And
Christy, how about those stories?
I mean, oh my gosh.
So she signed up for 3 weeks of doing this writing group, and we've been doing it since 2012. So
just amazing. But she would always, even when she was talking to us at the Community Foundation, she always found time to talk about the veterans group and how much it meant to her. It really meant more than that. So tell us a little bit more, Christy, though, because you were right there, right by her side.
We would meet weekly. Liz and I would meet over the phone and grab some, either like a piece from a podcast or of something from the New York Times or the New Yorker. And these folks are all very involved veterans themselves. We have 2 poets. Everyone has come really far in their writing. Also, they were, I think, exceptional to begin with. So we would have these wonderful conversations, and then we would write for about a half an hour. And it was important to Liz that people wrote with a pen on a piece of paper, and we called it a first draft. No worries about penmanship and spelling and grammatical errors and any of that stuff. Get it down. And then she would collect everything, and then she would let folks know some thoughts on it. I think her favorite thing to say was think about a title. No one ever wrote a title on their writing, which is sort of to encompass who your audience is. And then we would meet together, and they would share their stories, and we would do another round.
But I think you have a feather in your cap, don't you? Didn't you all publish a book? And nobody in this room other than Christy can say that.
No, we haven't published it quite yet, but we will let you know as soon as it is published. And that would be amazing to share that with our listeners.
My gosh. But talk about preserving stories. I mean, if we all learned something from Liz when we knew her, and now it's just telling the stories, preserving the stories about the ones we love.
How about the arc 3 turns into
I know.
into 13 years?
I think that's because of Christy.
Well, we when we finished our 3 weeks, the folks that we had said we want to do this longer, and so we would sometimes have guest speakers come in, and then after we'd been doing this for a little while, we wanted to take it on the road. So we went to other libraries. We would go to the Kiwanis Club or a meeting for the Rotary, and so we would have the folks read their stories because that's the most important part. And they came to ICRV radio and they were interviewed by you folks, and that's amazing too. Maybe at some point they can come back and read some of their works.
We would love it. Cynthia, 13 years for that program. That's amazing, but that's just a little piece of the 25-year arc with the Community Foundation. Tell me about that.
Oh my gosh. Well, I certainly wasn't there at the very beginning, but I heard all the stories about, I love the story of being a grassroots organization because, you know, we didn't get started with this huge bequest the way a lot of community foundations did. And I have this vision of people like Liz sitting around a table going, I'm going to put in $5. I'll put in 25 and starting what now has become, you know, we'll get bigger, but a larger community foundation. Building community was really important to those folks. And I love the fact that Liz remembered the arts. You honor somebody, your parents for what their passions were, and then you can just continue to, as she said, nurture the soul.
And I can say this because I'm kind of in the journalism field. To be able to nurture a legacy, right? To care for the generations that will follow us, even on a journalist's salary, is a big deal, and it is a message in and of itself. But there was a great conversation that Thayer led off, talking about a little bit of that 25-year perspective, that arc that Liz was able to share with us. Let's listen to Thayer.
Today is Liz Petry, and Liz is truly remarkable in our books for our relationship with her, because Liz can talk about what it's like to be one of the earliest board members, one of the first donors to operations, which means supporting the work that we do in the community as a group. She was a founder of the Fund for Women and Girls. She was one of our earliest Legacy Society members. So Liz, it's so exciting to have you here to talk about what it's been like to be part of the Community Foundation family for 25 years.
Thank you, Thayer. Well, I have to say it's been a wonderful 25 years, although I must admit I was kind of shocked when you reached out and said it had been 25 years. It's incredible. It's just amazing.
So, you know, Dave, I'm going to launch this asking Liz a question that I purposely and intentionally did not ask prior to the show as we got ready. So, Liz, how in the heck did you ever get connected in the very beginning with this wild and wacky bunch of people in throughout Middlesex County who had this weird idea to start a nonprofit together?
Well, you won't be surprised when I tell you that there were 2 people who twisted my arm, not very hard. One was Derry Dench, and the other was Willard McCrae. Now, before I describe them, I have to say that the running joke was, if you see either one of them walking towards you, run away, because they're going to get you involved in some community activity. And that was so true. So Derry was my big boss at the Middletown Press. I worked there as a reporter and as an editor. And Derry originally hired me actually back in the 70s, and then I came back to work there in the 90s. And after he and his brother Woody sold the paper, he was incredibly active in the community. And I don't remember exactly what the circumstances were. I was working at another newspaper, and I remember he called up and said, would you like to do this? Well, I didn't know what a community foundation was. I mean, you know, I was diving into, you know, The Simpsons and all this feature stuff that's recurrent. And not long after that, Willard McCrae, who had actually arranged for me to get my job at the press back in the day, called up and said, you've got to be on the board. You've got to be on the board. Well, I had to get permission from the people at the current, because I was supposed to be at work at 9 o'clock and the board meetings were in Middletown or in Essex at 8 o'clock. And there was no way I was getting up Route 9 and onto 91 and into Hartford by 9 in the morning. So I probably for the first year and a half or 2 years was running out the door at like 10 of 9 so I could be at work at, latest at 9:30. But those were the two gentlemen. Willard McCrae, of course, later became my uncle because I married his nephew, Larry Riley. But Willard was one of these people that he really did engage everybody that he knew in making the community better. And Darian and Willard were both already, I think they were founders of the foundation.
They were, you're right.
And they were pushing me, and I finally said to my boss at the current, well, can I do this? I promise I'll only be late once a month, and they said yes. I mean, it was good for them too. It was, good representing the community. So that's how I got on the board of the Community Foundation originally.
Wow. Oh, that's a phenomenal. Though I have to say, between you and me, I'm not surprised that those are the two people that, and I would have definitely guessed one of them, if not both, but because we had quite a few. But it just goes to show that people come together and they get these wild and wonderful ideas. And they start spreading the word. And I think we felt very humbled and very fortunate that throughout our lifetime as the Community Foundation, that's how lots of people have gotten to know us, is really someone says, oh, I know this great group and they can help you do that, rather than, necessarily from lots of formal stuff. But when you first joined the board in '98, did you envision, what was the vision of the Community Foundation?
Well,
for you,
thinking back, I wasn't really clear what my role was, and in fact, I said to them a couple of times, "Listen, I'm just this little reporter. I'm not somebody. I don't, and at that point, I think I had just switched from working like 3 or 4 in the afternoon till 1 or 2 in the morning, so I couldn't go to evening events." And finally, when I think it was actually when the Women and Girls Fund began to be organized, and they had some policy issues that I said, oh, okay, I can do this. And then finally, when the newsletter came along, I was like, this I know how to do. I can write for the newsletter. I can interview people. I can actually be a reporter again. So but I really didn't. I didn't have any clear picture at the beginning, but I do think by the time I got off the board, and I think I was on there for 9 years, that I felt I had made some contribution to the longevity of this organization, and I was very happy to do it. It was wonderful. So.
Can you believe? I mean, from the early years of however many funds there might have been, I think when we started our conversations, and that was only 7 years ago, there might have been 80 or 90 funds covering different verticals in the community areas of need and challenges, and nonprofits that are doing amazing things. To now, I think it is either nearing or over 300 funds. Can you imagine that type of an arc?
No, that's amazing. I mean, I had no idea. Well, and one of the things that I was able to do, which I was thrilled with, was that, as you, Dave, I'm sure you know, and most people do, that unless you're like a Wolf Blitzer level, journalists don't make a lot of money. And I kind of was like, well, I can make small donations, but I was able to do two things. One, set up the fund, the Anne and George Petry Fund, in memory of my parents, to which I've made, contributions over the years. And also finally got around to writing a will and leaving a legacy to the Community Foundation, which I expanded actually after Larry and I got married and we redid the wills. I added to that. So there are ways, even if you're not a wealthy person, right, immediately, that you can help out and make contributions.
I think, and I'm so glad that you talked about that in both of those, because there was something, Liz, that you and I talked about when we talked about doing the show today. First of all, as you know, because our perspective is that everybody is a philanthropist. Everybody gives back to their community in some way, shape, or form, whether it's a donation of money or a donation of time. And that's what makes our community so wonderful. And it's not the big gifts, you know, it's as our friend Sally DeQuilla down in Old Saybrook says all the time, you don't have to be Warren Buffett to make a difference in your community. And that is the goal of the Community Foundation. And particularly, like, for example, the fund that you started to honor your parents that supports the arts. And anybody and everybody who loves the arts can give to that and help it grow. So, you know, everybody gets to do it. And I think that's one of the things that's so special for me to get to know people like you and to be involved with the Community Foundation is seeing how all of these people come together to build our community through the Community Foundation and realize that there is no expectation for one person to do it all on their own.
Yeah, and I think that one of the intangibles and the thing that I value the foundation for particularly is the connections that I've made. And I'll just give you one example. I think it was at a grantee reception. Either you or Cynthia introduced me to this woman named Jennifer Glick. And we chatted, and I found out that she was an Army veteran. She was a nurse in Vietnam. And I invited her to come to the Veterans Writing Workshop that I run at the Russell Library in Middletown. Well, now on Zoom, but through Russell Library. And she joined our group, and she's become a good friend, and she's contributed so much because she's a poet. And we did not have any poets. We now have a second poet who's joined the group, but she's also the only woman in the group. And it has just been such a joy and so valuable. And you all made that connection. And that had nothing to do with giving a grant or receiving a grant. That was just a personal connection that I just have found wonderful. So thank you.
Well, I love hearing that, and you know us. I mean, and that I think that actually is Dave will tell you, that's one of the best parts of what we do is that we get together with people and we introduce people because we think they'll just hit it off, right? They have interesting things in common, or they should know about one another. And then the next thing we know, we hear all these incredible interwoven stories of where it goes from there.
Well, you all have been generous with the writing group. The grant to Russell Library helped us publish this preview of the book, and we're still working on the full edition, but it's been just wonderful. The group's been going for 12 years, so we've got some longevity too, and it's one of the highlights of my week to meet with. It was the guys, and now it's Jennifer and all these now Vietnam veterans. We started with a couple from World War II, but they've both passed away, and our veterans from Korea also has passed away, but the stories are getting preserved. And I guess if there's an overarching theme in my life, it's preserving stories, my family's stories and these stories of the veterans, and it's just been wonderful.
Well, Christy, I don't know about you, but I just love relearning things about Liz and her family and all of the wonderful things that she does and did. But I have to say, the thing that kept on rolling through my head as I was listening to her, how humble she always was, because she always put a light on everybody else but herself. So
Always. She was such a wonderful friend. As you can hear, listening to her talk, she had a wonderful laugh. She was such a compassionate person. She's a great listener. She's a great storyteller. She had such a wonderful sense of humor and fun, but she would also speak up against injustice. She would speak up against or speak up for veterans and say when things were not going well in that area. And when she spoke, people listened to her.
absolutely.
Cynthia, I just hearing how that segment ended, if there is an overarching theme in my life, it's preserving stories. I got to tell you, my eyes are welling up just because, I personally, we all have our callings, but I personally can't can't find a stronger mission statement than something like that, because that's what it's all about, is leaving these things behind for generations to come, and maybe their lives will be richer, their end results, their life's work will be more complete. That's what it's all about.
And I think if there were anybody that could change the world, Liz could. And this is, one of my favorite topics about how she did preserve so much about her family history.
Yeah, so it goes on from there, right? Writers groups, et cetera, books, et cetera, and then even into documentaries.
Oh my gosh, what a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful project. And so we are all committed to making sure that that happens.
And here's Cynthia actually talking a little bit about taking the story to the big screen with Liz Petry.
This is one of my favorite topics, and this is one that I want Liz, it's bring us back and then forward to where we are with the James family documentary. And then every time, Dave, I'm with Liz, or every time I'm learning about the James family documentary or the James family, there are new things that come out. And I will put a shout out to Old Saybrook Historical Society, because they invited me to their exhibit on the family a couple of weeks ago, and I was mesmerized I thought I knew it all. I don't. So Liz will share some of those wonderful stories. So Liz, would you provide us with some updates for, let's take it back a little bit, and everybody should know that we, the Community Foundation, are the fiscal sponsor for the documentary film. And that's one of the many kinds of funds that we have here at the Community Foundation, and we're honored to do that.
Well, thank you so much, Cynthia. I think the last time I spoke here about the documentary, we had just finished, or were just finishing up with a grant from Connecticut Humanities, which the foundation managed for us. We received a grant from the National Endowment for the Arts, but we haven't been able to do anything with it because we were supposed to be visiting college campuses, and of course they've all been shut down. So I have great hopes that in the fall we will be going to Hampton University, which is where my mother actually attended briefly, but two of her aunts and an uncle attended back around 1900. And we're also supposed to go up to Harvard because Anna Louise James's papers are up there. My mother donated them to the Schlesinger Library at Radcliffe. And there's some material in there that we need to film. But as I said, we haven't been able to get any of that done. The impetus, I should go back and say, for this documentary was that my cousin, Ashley James, who is an award-winning filmmaker, decided after I'd published the book, Can Anything Beat White, that he wanted to try to interweave the stories that were in the letters that were in that book with the stories that my mother told in her short stories and some pieces of the novels and stuff. So we've been talking to scholars, filming, and traveling around Connecticut to pull this together. This is a long, slow process, of course, made even slower because of COVID. But that's kind of where we are at this point. And I'm excited that we'll be able to continue with it.
Oh, and let's pray that, the COVID is behind us. But just for some context, Liz, because I'm sure that Dave's audience always expands and perhaps they're not familiar with your family. So if you could provide just a little snippet on that, because we here in Middlesex County, and certainly in Old Saybrook, the Shoreline area, know all about your family.
Well, I have to say that I am descended from some of the world's most intimidating people in terms of their accomplishments. My grandfather, Peter Lane, was the first African-American to get a pharmacy license in Connecticut. That was in 1896, I believe. Then his sister-in-law, my grandmother's younger sister, Anna Louise James, became the first African-American woman to receive a pharmacy license in Connecticut. And she took over James Pharmacy, which people still rave about her and about that place. It's at 2 Pennywise Lane in Old Saybrook. Don't you just love the address?
I do.
Building was actually moved onto that site. And has a big plaque on it that says, Lafayette made a purchase here, I think 1824. But it also now, thanks to the foundation and others, has a plaque honoring Miss James, who was also one of the first women to register to vote when the 19th Amendment was passed. So as I was saying, I come from this intimidating people. And then, of course, my grandparents gave birth to my mother, who became an author and the first African-American woman to sell more than 1 million copies of a book. So, and she, P.S., was also a pharmacist. And as I was talking about last week, she played this nosy newspaper reporter in this play that ran forever, actually, in what's now the Schomburg Library in Harlem, called On Strivers' Row, which was mocking the bourgeoisie of the Black community. And she actually acted with the group for a number of years, but I think that was the only role where she was sort of had some longevity.
Oh my gosh.
She sort of carried on a tradition of, being on the stage, because Miss James, the pharmacist, had her store open for years and years and years, when one day this young woman came in, and she came from another family that was really intimidating in terms of their accomplishments, and she was upset. She wanted to become an actress, but she didn't think she could do it. And Miss James said, I think you can. Gave her the money to go to New York to audition for the theater. And that young woman was Katharine Hepburn.
Can you imagine?
Are you kidding me?
No, I am not kidding. And
I mean, really?
I have one little piece of that in addition, that when Miss James died, Miss Hepburn wrote to my mother saying that Anna Louise James was the only woman who had ever intimidated her.
You imagine that, too?
And so as I said, I come from this line of people who are thoroughly intimidating in terms of their accomplishments.
Oh, but Liz, you are too modest. Dave, can you believe that?
That unreal.
It truly is. It just blew me away when I heard that at the Old Saybrook Historical Society grand opening. But Liz, I need to stop you right there. Dave and I said at the last session last week that we're in awe of your accomplishments, and we asked each other, what did we do today? So
no. Well, I have to tell you, though, just in terms of accomplishments, one of the times that I was working on the book about my mom at home inside, I sat down with a journal entry for one day where she had listed all the things that she planned to do, and then kind of documented that the next day she had done them all. And she must have gotten up at 4 a.m. and gone to bed at midnight, because I don't see how she had time to do all the things that she listed, but in fact she did. So, these women had unbelievable energy.
Oh, and especially not having all of the technology and devices that we have right now. Oh my gosh.
Liz, do you have an idea, how the landscape was then, how important a community member, a pharmacist was?
Oh, it was absolutely crucial, particularly when she first started out. I mean, there weren't nearly as many people down on the shoreline as there are now, but there was one doctor who kind of rode a circuit from Old Lyme to Madison, and I think north as far as Deep River, maybe Chester. So he normally would not be in his office. He'd be out, mending broken bones or delivering babies or whatever. So if you had a medical problem, you went to the pharmacy, because you knew, state law has been since before time that there has to be a licensed pharmacist on the premises if the store is open because of the controlled substances and stuff. So you would go to the pharmacy. And I know I heard stories when I was a little girl about how my grandfather actually mended broken arms. And of course, he had to deal with stuff like ear infections from the polluted water in Long Island Sound. And this was in the days before antibiotics. So they were the center of the community in a way and that I think people don't really understand today, because, you know, if you fall and hurt yourself, you go to the urgent clinic or you go to the emergency room. Well, they didn't, you know, how do you get from Old Saybrook with no Route 9, no car, to Middletown or New London or New Haven in time? You don't, you go to the pharmacy.
It's mind-boggling to me, totally mind-boggling. Just absolutely amazing. And so you're on this quest to make the documentary, and I have to tell you, Dave, because we're in the back and trying to, you know, help with administrative support on this, I had no clue about how exacting and exhausting it must be to put this all together. And Liz, listening to you, you weave such a wonderful story. If we could only just clone you and make the film right now, but tell us, because it is exacting to do that.
Well, and I have to say that I'm probably not the person to be having this discussion with, because I'm not a filmmaker. This is my very first experience with this. Ashley and Catherine Golden, his wife, are wonderful filmmakers. They won awards. They just had a film at South by Southwest. You know, so they've been doing this for pretty much all of their lives, but this is a whole new thing for me. And they like to use the NEH, NEA, nonprofit organizations to fund the work, because they get the films on public TV and so forth. And I don't fully understand all of the administrative aspect of it, but I know we had to set up a shooting schedule when we gathered at the Historical Society in Old Saybrook, because they're also working with us on the project. We interviewed Walt Woodward, who's the Connecticut State Historian, Farrah Griffin, who is a Petry scholar and teaches at Columbia. She's a powerhouse. And Diane Isaacs, who wrote the first dissertation about my mom. And then, you know, we sort of edited that material. We've since interviewed a few more people. But we really, I mean, I think probably I'm not the person to be giving you a complete answer to that question.
But it really is fascinating. And let's, you know, in listening to you and talk about the history of your family, let's give a shout out to the historical societies out there.
Yes.
First, we'll start with the Old Saybrook Historical Society, which has done a marvelous job with the exhibit, and I'm glad it's going to be up for 2 years. But if anyone gets a chance to go see the exhibit, please do, because fabulous, fabulous, fabulous work. But I think of all of the other historical societies in our county that just tell the stories of those who lived in our area before us.
Yeah.
We'd lose all that.
I know. And I'm so pleased that Jesse Nasta has become the head of the Middlesex County Historical Society. He's actually a consultant on the exhibit for us in Old Saybrook, and a wonderful historian. His main focus right now is the Beaman Triangle in Middletown, but he has his knowledge of African American history is just spectacular. And he's been working with us, and that exhibit came about because the people down there approached me about doing something about Miss James and my mom. It was 2 years ago, and that's been another whole project that's I'm impressed, because they're an all volunteer organization, that they are able to do such a wonderful job of exhibits and, you know, just explaining the town to the public.
Can you share, as we try to encourage people to get to the Old Saybrook Historical Society and to partake and to see it, can you share some of the elements of the exhibit that were especially meaningful to you?
Well, absolutely. The two big things that we spent a lot of time working on getting, because they're at the Connecticut Historical Society in Hartford, are my mother's desk. It is what she called it, a partner's desk, because it has drawers on two sides and it's huge. So two people could sit across from each other and they both have storage area and so forth. So we got that. And then the other thing, which my mother actually had donated to the Historical Society, was a sampler that was created in 1839 by this little African-American girl whose family lived in Old Saybrook. I think Miranda Robinson, who later became Miranda Anderson, was 8 years old, 8 or 9, when she made this sampler. And the Historical Society wrote me a few years back saying that they were aware of only 2 such samplers by African-American girls in the state of Connecticut. And one of those 2 is now on display. It had been a gift of Mrs. Anderson to my grandmother, and that's how it came to be in the family. But my mother decided rightfully that we didn't have a way to preserve it. And I think that's something that's crucial in terms of the historical societies, that they're preserving physical objects to actually continue the legacy. But people can look at this beautiful little sampler that was done by this little girl, 1839.
Wow.
I think this is phenomenal.
And just in case our listeners, sampler is the embroidery art form, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's on. It can be on silk, cotton, whatever the backing. I think this one is on linen, and it's actually rather coarse linen. And then the little girls would stitch usually their alphabet and some religious saying. And there are a lot of them out there. I mean, if you go, put sampler into Google or 19th century sampler, you'll come up with tons. But the fact of the matter was that the little black girls who were doing these, probably what the family did after they were done was use the material for something else, because people recycled everything. So not very many of them have survived. And this one is just phenomenal.
No, Liz, listening to you, because you were given a gift by those letters, and you were that you found in the cookie tin, and the art of letter writing is going away, if it's not dead right now. But in preserving family history, what would you encourage those of us who don't have this lineage that you have, but our families are important? What would you encourage us to do and start doing to preserve our own history?
Well, I'll tell you what, I got spoiled dealing with my mother's family because there was so much written material.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been trying to work on something about my dad's family, but that's one of those situations where the records, he was from Louisiana, and the records that exist, some of them got destroyed in fires and floods, and the people weren't nearly as literate as my mom's family was. And the records that are there were often written in French or Spanish because the priests came from France and Spain and were not English speakers. The first thing that I would tell everybody is talk to the older people in your family. Ask them what they remember. Take notes. If you don't want to write, record it on your phone as a voice memo or something. But just begin the process of talking to people who may know. There are tons and tons and tons now of digitized newspapers, all kinds of things online, so you can really get a sense of the era that the people lived in. And you may find actually that some of your family did make the newspaper in one form or another. There's a wonderful book that just got published called Ancestor Trouble. The woman's name is Maud, without an E, M-A-U-D, last name Newton, N-E-W-T-O-N. And she has, she knew a lot about her family, but she also has just wonderful ways of kind of getting into archives and finding stories. She discovered, the myth was that one of her great-grandfathers was married 13 times and got shot wives. Well, she discovered that he was really, in fact, married 10 times and was shot by one of his wives.
Well, 10 or 13.
Yeah, really.
Is there a real difference?
but in any event, that's what I would say, that you know, and go through, if the older people have been living in their houses for a long time, ask to go through trunks in the attic, ask to, you know, see if they have preserved things.
Liz, this may be well, it's important. It's important. So sorry if it's a direct question, but was it difficult for you in this process of making this documentary? Was it difficult for you to deal with you know, race relations 100 you know, plus years ago, and see where the difficulties are on the current social and political scales sets are today, and realize that we're dealing with some of the same issues? Was that the fact that you're almost running in place where you hope that things are progressing, but maybe they're not progressing that much?
It's kind of a love-hate thing. I mean, I love the fact that I can explore this, but I hate what I see when I go back and look. There's a wonderful book by Henry Louis Gates called Stony the Road that was just published not too long ago, in which he has all these images from newspapers, magazines during the Jim Crow era, and a lot of it in the South, but also stuff from Connecticut, stuff from Ohio. And that, you know, it's that old saying, plus ça change. The more things change, the more they stay the same. And it's painful to know that we haven't made more progress, but there are ways in which, I mean, women do have the right to vote now, which they didn't have. You know, Black people are able to vote in a lot of places where they couldn't 100 years ago. My grandfather down in Louisiana couldn't vote. He was a taxpayer, he owned property, but he couldn't vote. You know, and so I think the obstacles are going to continue, but people are going to continue to prevail too.
Even more important to tell the stories, right, Cynthia?
Absolutely. And I'm just sitting here shaking my head going, yes, the more we talk about this, the more we talk about the positive things that happened. Yes, we do have obstacles, but there are still a lot of positive things that have happened out there. You know, Liz, I honestly could sit here and listen to you all day long, because I learned, seriously, because I learned so much all the time from you. And I have to say, I hope I make you blush with this. Thank you for sharing your talents with everybody. I mean, not only are you sharing them with Dave and me and the rest of the audience, but you're also sharing them with the veterans, with our libraries, with our historical societies, and teaching us that we all deserve to tell our story. So I thank you for that.
Well, thank you so much. I have to say that when, you know, we were down there for the opening of the exhibit, and I said this then too, that Miss James and my mother too, but particularly Miss James, whenever somebody praised her for something, she always had this stare that she gave everybody, saying, "What is wrong with you people? I'm just doing my job." You know, she didn't understand what all the fuss was about. And my mother was the same way. And so I feel like, well, I'm just doing my job. That's my reaction. But thank you, Cynthia. I appreciate what you said.
Can you imagine saying just doing my job? Christy, I don't know about you, but listening to her, I could sit here, Dave, for hours and hours and hours. But the thing that came to mind as I listened to her, she paints pictures with words and has that incredible talent. And of course, she would stare at us and say, "What are you talking about?" But just that gift of being able to engage somebody as she's telling the stories. And I could picture everything that she was talking about, that little girl doing the sampler. So what a gift.
Christy, she's obviously pretty well read. She visits the library more than just for the vets program.
Yes. So yes, we would have great conversations about books too, and we were always trading books back and forth. But I mean, she'll definitely be remembered for her persistence, researching her family, sharing her history. But she's such a storyteller. You know, her writing was so compelling. It was historical, but these are real people. And I think that's the piece that is so important for people to understand is this, you should do this yourself and research your family because you have people like this as well.
Well, the one thing I am taking away from this is that we do have to keep the conversation going, because in this polarized world, we all seem to be in silos. So we all, even if it's just one person for 5 minutes a day on the phone, I mean, that's the gift that Liz is leaving us with.
And an example of keeping that conversation going it was an event actually at the Kate, which
Right.
was fantastic.
Oh my gosh, it was
a free event. Right. And it was called Miss James and Ann Petry in Saybrook and Beyond. And one of the things that we've learned that you can do with people is, yes, the quality of their body of the work needs to be evaluated. You can also get an idea of their rock star status by who hangs out with them. And Dr. Farah Jasmine Griffin, who is an amazing rock star at Columbia University, and then Dr. Jessie Nasta joined Liz on the panel to talk about these amazing women, Miss James and Ann Petry. It was an incredible event. I was telling Christy that Ted Levy had no idea how many people would show up because it was a free unticketed event,
it
right?
Was packed.
It was packed.
And nobody left. And it was just phenomenal.
I had the honor of having a little, because we were moderating that event, and I got to talk to Liz on air beforehand to get a little backstory and encourage people to show up. And it was an amazing conversation that started out with her telling us why this event and the conversation you just talked about, Cynthia, the ongoing conversation was so important to her.
Well, as I think I've mentioned before on your program, one of my missions in life is to keep the legacy of my mother particularly, but also Miss James, alive and people's awareness of them front and center. And I'm going to give you just a brief example. I don't know whether the public around here is aware of it, but last month, there was a block in Harlem named Ann Petry Place. And it was an amazing event. But one of the upsetting parts of the whole thing was that the young man who is the council person for that, the city council person for that district, who's probably in his 30s, said that he never learned any of Harlem's history in school, even though he had grown up in Harlem and attended school there. So one of my missions is to say, listen, there's all this history in your backyard that you need to know and need to understand. And I'm going to let Farah Griffin and Jessie Nasta, who are both academics and brilliant professors, give you sort of the world overview. What I'm going to do is just tell family stories.
Well, we had Jesse on earlier this week, and he said that these are two amazing women just in general. If you didn't factor in their color, but when you do, the import of their lives, the ripple effect is exponentially increased. He also mentioned that Ann Lane Petry was one that didn't care to put the spotlight on her, that the legacy is really in her writings, but the spotlight was not to be on her. And it is only through your storytelling that we better understand Ann Petry, and that's an important piece of the puzzle, especially as one gets older and one generation to the next may lose some of these important stories. So, what is it that you want us to understand about Ann Petry?
Basically, I think that she was able to overcome a whole variety of obstacles. One being that her family wanted her to be a pharmacist, not a writer, that she confronted some pretty blatant racism in Old Saybrook as she was growing up. And then when she moved to Harlem, she had an economic struggle, and she really fought to make women, particularly women in Harlem, successful at what they did. And I want people in general, but particularly young people, to understand that this is a woman who was born at the beginning of the 20th century, and that the stories that she wrote are still in print, are still being republished, and in some ways are pretty scarily current events. A woman trying to bring up a child by herself in Harlem, a Black family afraid to call the police when one of their family members goes missing. I mean, these are current stories that are on the front page of the newspaper.
One of the things that one of the panelists, Jesse Nast, really focuses on in all of his studies and his research and his writings is the evolution of Black communities in the Northeast and in our state. He shared with us, he set up a little context in terms of what it was like to be Black in the 1800s in Connecticut, 1850s and beyond specifically. And, you know, there were communities in Hartford, albeit not large ones, he said, but there were communities that where one could hang out with others and share a cultural experience and relate to each other so much better in Hartford, in New Haven. And he said, even in Middletown. But what was it like in the late 1800s and then even early 1900s? So for both of these amazing women, what was it like to be Black in Old Saybrook, Liz? I mean, is there any way you can help us take a pulse on that?
I don't know if I can even conjure that up for myself, but I do know that when my grandparents moved to Old Saybrook about 1900, there was one other Black family living there. There were also individuals who were living and working in the homes of the wealthy white people that lived there, but there was one other Black family that had come from New York sometime right after the Civil War. So my grandparents were not the first. But, my grandfather got threatened when he opened the drugstore that they didn't want an N-word pharmacist in town, and he persisted. So, and of course, I think one of the theories I have is that part of the reason that we did achieve a measure of success and acceptance down there was that he saved people's lives.
Right.
You know, and if somebody is rescuing you, you really don't care whether the hand is black or white. You know, and so he was able to develop a level of respect. And of course, Miss James built on that. People adored her. Little kids adored her. She was very generous with giving credit to people. Over time, I think perceptions changed some, but it had to be really, really rough down there at the beginning of the 20th century.
You spoke earlier about Harlem and about how Ann Petry, she, as I understand it, it was in the mid to late 30s that she married George Petry, and that was when there was the move to Harlem. And it seems like something happened in Harlem, Liz, where a flame was ignited that would never, never dim.
I think you're right. What I figured out especially after seeing where she lived, because this block in Harlem that they named for her is a corner where she and my dad rented their first apartment after they got married in 1938. And I think what happened was, she had visited her family in Hartford. She'd been to New London. She'd been to New Haven, but she had never lived institutional racism. There's a scene in the street where Lydia Johnson, the heroine, is looking at this meat in the grocery store, and it's obviously rotten, and it's been colored to make it look healthy. And my mother never had to deal with that. What she dealt with was Mr. Maynard Fear trampling her mother's vegetable garden, and I guess by way of apology or whatever, several weeks later, this very fresh piece of beef would arrive on their doorstep. So there was a complete change, or she underwent a complete change in perspective on living among Black people and experiencing the kind of racism and poverty, and of course in her case sexism, that she's never encountered in Old Saybrook.
I went to the Old Saybrook Historical Society. We got it there, and we will on Sunday thank a whole boatload of people, because this doesn't happen easily, and it's important for the conversation to be had and for the exhibit to be on display, but to turn up the volume on it and make sure that people are able to visit and are given room for contemplation. And yesterday was one such example for me, because I saw a school group come in from Old Saybrook and sit and see the film and see the exhibit. And I'll be diplomatic here. It wasn't the most diverse crowd, Liz, but this is what it's all about on Sunday. Is okay. It is what it is in Connecticut, but it doesn't matter. What color the audience is, the conversation needs to be had.
Agreed. Absolutely agreed. And I think one of the things that's so important is for people, and this is one of the parts of my mother's genius, is to put yourself in the other person's shoes. What's it like? And I know it's hard, and not everybody has the imagination to be able to do that. But think about what it's like. The example that I think of is Dan Rather went to China with Richard Nixon in the early 70s, and he said he never understood a bit of what it was like to be Black in the United States until he walked out of his hotel room in Beijing and they started screaming white devil at him.
Wild. That is wild.
Yeah.
That is wild. Hey, let's talk a little bit about your flame being ignited, your spark. As I understand it, Vassar College, then UPenn Law School. How's that law degree working out for you, by the way?
Big mistake. I take that back. The law degree actually did give me one skill, which is that I can read and absorb massive amounts of information very, very quickly, and I can analyze it easily and pretty clearly. Practicing law was not temperamentally suited to me, or I wasn't temperamentally suited to it, because I just don't think the adversarial system is the way to solve or resolve disputes. And when I was in the practice, there was no such thing really as mediation. It was just beginning to appear on the scene. And even now, it's a minimal part of the legal system. But I mean, I don't know what I would replace it with, but I enjoyed my 15 years in Philadelphia. It's an interesting city. But I just don't recommend, and I tell people, if you're thinking about going to law school, think long and hard, and especially these days, given the cost. I mean, I got out with minimal investment, and I think I paid off whatever student loans I had within 5 years or something. But nowadays, it's a lifetime investment. Yeah. And unless you're committed, don't do it.
Well, there's advice that I think a lot of people wish they had had a few years ago.
I know.
Hey, Liz, I don't know exactly the chronology, but I know it went from law school to becoming a reporter. You were at Middletown Press, the Meriden Record Journal, even the Hartford Courant. At what point did reporting the news evolve into, wait a minute, I think I have something important to write, less as a journalist and more as an author? When did that slight little shift happen?
Well, actually, I went back to journalism after I finished practicing law. I had been a cub reporter for the Middletown Press right after I got out of college, and then left and went to law school and did all this other stuff, and then came back to Connecticut, back to the Middletown Press, because it was then owned by Woody and Derry Dench, and they were the best employers in the world, and I continue to say that. I worked for them twice. And I stayed in journalism, and I loved it, but I could see that the profession was changing. And at the point where I found the 400 letters that my grandmother saved, and I opened one up, addressed to her from her brother Bill, saying, please send $35 so I can bribe a Georgia sheriff because I just shot a white man for bothering me. I was like, I've got a book. And that was when I quit.
Oh my gosh. Help me. Still a little bit of a reference to journalism. So full disclosure, my first gig out of college was with the Associated Press. And I learned very, very early in my schooling there that there's no such thing as objectivity. We all come to everything with a filter, which, by the way, is a pretty cool life lesson. And I wish actually that was shared in all careers and in all kind of verticals of our world, because that's what perspective is. It's not a bad thing, but it should be understood that we all come with filters. So how do you write about your family and maintain or try to distance yourself from the filter that you naturally bring to any equation?
Well, and I, by the way, I absolutely agree with you that there is no such thing as objectivity, and I think we need to be honest about that. I'm not sure that I fully succeeded, but basically I put my reporter's eye on these family members. Now, I knew my mother obviously really well, and I knew Miss James fairly well, although she was rather elderly when I became conscious of who she was and what she was doing. But a lot of them I never knew personally, and of course that made it a lot easier. But I think basically to take a step back and say, well, listen, if this was somebody else's aunt or somebody else's great grandmother, what would you say about them? How would you treat them? And I hopefully I succeeded in doing that.
Oh my gosh, did she ever? And let's just take a moment to say, what would we say about Liz? And I've got my list. I spent today going, okay, author, community-minded, humble, brainiac, journalist. You could go on, but the one thing I want to say, and I think what a treasure and how lucky we are that we knew her.
Very lucky.
I'll add role model, advocate,
Good listener,
storyteller. I think that was on your list.
That's okay. We could go on and on and on. But I think the one lesson that I've learned from all of this, and thank you, Dave, for putting this all together, is to just keep the conversation going, to, realize that everybody has a story to tell and they're all important.
If you want to put lessons learned in today's broadcast and also in just the life and legacy of Liz Petry, if you want to put it into action, are there ways that people can donate, Cynthia?
Oh, you are so good. First of all, let's make sure that people know about the Veterans Writing Group at Russell Library and make donations there. Certainly, if people have a passion for the arts and want to donate to the Anne and George Petry Fund, and certainly if anybody wants to help us keep the film going forward, the James Family Documentary Fund at the Community Foundation.
Christy, any final thoughts?
Just as a person that led the Veterans Writing Group, there was one gentleman who in the beginning came and he said, I'm really not a writer. And Liz would admonish him. She would say, you are a writer. It's mentally part of the skill. You have to believe in yourself. And he ended up keeping a pad of paper by the side of his bed and he would jot down ideas. And he became one of our best writers. So don't sell yourself short, and we'll continue to honor Liz's legacy.
Thank you, Dave.
Thank you, ladies. What an
Thank you,
amazing
Christy.
person.
Thank you.
Guys.